Hi, I'm Dr. Peter D'Adamo, and welcome to the second Facebook Ask Me Anything, an hour of joy and fun-filled wisdom from yours truly, Dr. Peter D'Adamo, answering questions both that have been put into the queue and questions from our live audience. So, without any further ado, let's get into the questions and get started. I once read that O was the original blood type, and then the updated Eat Right for Your type said A was the first. Then a genetic shift happened that could have doomed an organism occurred. Which is the correct answer? Of the modern people who inhabit the planet, the O genotype and O phenotype are what's called teleologically older. They're the manifestation that is the oldest in terms of the extant blood types. The evidence suggests from a scientist in Japan named Seitao that there was a prototypical type A that represented what is known in genetics as the wild type. This is the form that basically the other types manifest off of. And this makes perfect sense. It appears that it didn't survive in some form that carried over into modern manifestations. But it makes perfect sense because in genetics, O is a very odd occurrence. It's something called a frame shift mutation. And to just give you a moment and to think about just how unique the blood types are, there are 4 types of mutations in genetics: a frame shift mutation, a single nucleotide polymorphism, a codominant type gene. So excuse me, I take that back. There's 3. A codominant. The ABO blood typing system is the only system that has all 3. Okay, the A and B are produced by a SNP variation, single nucleotide polymorphism. Type O is produced by a frame shift, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. And type AB is produced by what's called codominance. Both the A and B alleles are not dominant in a genetic sense, they just coexist. So if you get a A allele from mom and a B allele from dad, you are AB. Now with type O, it's even more interesting. With type O is produced by literally plunking out a letter of your DNA and moving the entire rest of the alphabet over one, called a frame shift. This is normally considered to be a lethal mutation. Typically, when these types of things occur, it's not good. Can you imagine if you had a piece of computer code where you pulled out something and moved everything over? Nothing after that would make sense. It couldn't be read the same way. But there was something about that that allowed O to survive. And it makes perfect sense that they would have come off of an earlier blood type because you wouldn't have started the world with a frame shift mutation. It would have had to have been off of another existing type. But in the use of the book, it didn't make sense to go through any great detail about earlier proto-blood types and things because it didn't make sense to explain that there was this thing that isn't even here anymore. We were just really talking about what came first in the modern day sense of the word. For confirmed hydrogen methane SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth has the anachronism SIBO, S-I-B-O. In someone sensitive to medications, what treatment approach has given you the best long-term success? Well, that's an interesting question because bacterial overgrowth can come for a couple of different reasons. The most common one is that the stomach is not doing its job acting as a barrier to all the bacteria that are coming in through your diet, through your food, through your secretions that go into your stomach and are supposed to hit a pool of acid, which is then supposed to disinfect everything so that when it goes into the lower part of your body where you sort of assimilate, there's not a whole lot of live bacteria, buggy stuff going on. So one of the first things you try to do with SIBO is get a grip on just how effective the stomach is doing its job with the hydrochloric acid and what are called the parietal functions, the digestive enzymes. The other thing you can have is that you can have a deficiency of a chemical called secretory IgA. Secretory IgA is an immunoglobulin, so it's an antibody that is made on the lining of your gut. So the mucus in your digestive tract has an antibody that's made which acts as a kind of adhesive paint, is the way it's been described. And the idea is that it kind of adheres to pathogens, viruses, and like most antibodies, it doesn't actually kill anything, but it tags the substance so that the killers can recognize it and then go on and destroy the pathogen. And a lot of people do have deficiencies of secretory IgA, most commonly in what are known as non-secretors of the blood type system. So if you're a blood type non-secretor, in other words, 25% of the population, you will have a likelihood of having low levels of secretory IgA, which actually explains why non-secretors have higher rates of celiac disease, higher rates of Crohn's disease. They don't have a lot of the protective mechanisms that the other 80% of the population have. The other issue is that you can have SIBO simply because you have a dysregulated microbial community. In other words, in a dysbiosis, in an unbalanced system, you're sort of then leading yourself on to having further imbalance. And that's a common thing in people who are using medications, people who are on diets with a lot of ultra-processed foods, or things of that sort. The other aspect to it, of course, is medications. And I think the most important thing to understand as to what to do for it is to understand really where the cause is arriving from. If it's in the stomach, you might want to look at it taking something called betaine hydrochloride, or utilizing herbs that are known as tonics like gentian and candarango. These are things that bring up the stomach acid levels if the stomach acid levels are low. If you have a situation where the intestinal tract is imbalanced, it lacks diversity, then you might want to start thinking about using probiotics that contain a bug called Akkermansia, like the polyflora does, because Akkermansia reestablishes the normal distribution of bacteria in the intestinal tract because it acts like a keystone to the growth of all the others. And so without this keystone, the system becomes a little bit unhinged. And obviously, if you're a non-secretor, you might want to adjust your diet in light of that. There are things that do increase secretory IgA, for instance. Some of the immunogenic botanicals do. I like using a herb called andrographis in situations like that, which you see in the security product, the Genoma Security product. What's the advantage of doing SWAMI over the regular blood type diet, non-secretor, secretor? And what's the advantages? This is from my old friend Ed Amb. Can you give details? When you follow the diet for blood type A, you're going into a book of mine, you're going to the chapter for blood type A, and you're following the diet for type A. When you do SWAMI, you're filling out reams of information peculiar to you. Whether this finger is longer than that finger, whether your leg is longer than at the upper leg or the lower leg, whether your fingerprint distributions match. All these things go into a potluck of evaluations that allows the software to generate a diet that's uniquely specific to you. At one time I sat down and computed that in the SWAMI universe, the odds of a diet exactly reproducing is about 1 in 12 million. So you're getting a whole lot more specificity. Now in some people, that specificity is not required. You just do the blood type diet, and if you've got some great results, well, you're done. Everything is exactly the way you need it to be. And some people need to go further because either they're interested in high performance or the diet as is not giving them the level of results that they want. And the next step would be to go to something that's a little bit more specific to who you are. And that kind of a thing is best suited by using software. And the next version of SWAMI 23, if I do say so myself, is I haven't rewritten this program in over 15 years, mainly because it's so complicated. Every time I tried to get involved in rewriting it, I would take one look at the code and my enthusiasm would dampen. But since coming back from the illness, I've had an awakening of my new capacities here. And one of the things I've done is gone back and redone the entire program and all the calculation engines behind it. And I used a lot of, the dirty word of the millennium here. I used a lot of AI to help me with the coding. It didn't help me in structuring the program, but it absolved me from having to find innumerable ways of writing the code. It made a massive difference in it. So I think you see when 23 is released, which will be somewhere in the next month or two, it's going to be a mind-blowing experience for people to use it. And that's another thing to think about, whether or not. And it's very cost effective. It's not an expensive program. You buy it, you run it, you get a meal planner, you get cookbook. It's like a lot of different things. There's even a small version that runs in the browser on your iPhone, so you can have that with you. I have the glycosynergy and direction state to take 1 capsule twice a day between meals. How soon after finishing a meal should it be taken to have the desired effect? Generally an hour. With most things having to do with passage through your intestinal tract, it doesn't even have to do with glycosynergy. It could do, for instance, with a medicine I take because of my transplant that I have to take, in addition to it, I have to take magnesium because this medicine depletes magnesium in the body. So I researched, and it turned out that it's about an hour for me to take magnesium before the drug or the drug before the magnesium. Really what you want it to do is to have this, neither of the two be in the stomach at the same time. And as long as one's got a little bit of a leg up on the other, you're fine. So I would say an hour would be more than adequate. And that would go far beyond glycosynergy. Any solution for an O positive with GERD? Well, you know, it's a complex illness. And one of the problems with GERD is that, you know, you do get a lot of reflux. And that can get up into the throat area. Believe it or not, one of the problems that occurs with GERD is very realized is that people with GERD often have respiratory problems because the GERD produces a plume of acidic gas coming from the stomach. And if that gas is actually inhaled, it then acts on as an irritant on the respiratory passages. So again, it's another reason to get it under control. Now, the standard treatments are things like Pepsid, which is moderately effective, and the PPIs, which are very effective. PPIs come with their own baggage. You know, they tend to deplete certain types of minerals and vitamins. The classic is the PPI depleting vitamin B12. The other side of the coin is that they are immediately effective. They do have some other problems. They're actually literally too good at what they do, because a lot of times they'll drop the acid level in the stomach down to the point where the stomach is no longer able to function as a defensive barrier and is no longer able to do a decent job breaking down proteins effectively. So now a lot of these undigested proteins are in the lower digestive tract without the stomach having done its proper job on them. A couple of things that worked very well for GERD I always found was, believe it or not, melatonin, which is the thing people use to go to sleep. I found 3 milligrams of melatonin before bed definitely helped my patients with GERD. Other things that sometimes work as well is there's a semi-amino acid called glutamine, which you can also take in capsule form. There's the old classic naturopath thing, and it depends on your diet, but you can get this in capsule form, is cruciferous vegetables, in particular cabbage. Cabbage has a component in there called, believe it or not, vitamin U, anti-peptic ulcer factor it's called. And for years, when we had no better treatment for stomach ulcers, that was the go-to, to just have the patient juice raw cabbage. They can mix it with carrot if they found it unpalatable, and they could use that. And it's damn near close to a curative device. So again, a lot of this is going to be dependent on the person, but those two areas. Another one I use, believe it or not, is a homeopathic medicine called anacardium in the 30C strength. Has had some benefit for me in the past. I'm not the world's greatest homeopath. I know the materia medica well. And I found a few of the remedies do tend to perform reliably, and that's one of them. I read that cats have different blood types. If so, would feeding them foods based on your blood type help ward off certain cat illnesses? Well, animals do have different types of blood. Humans are the only species that has all 4 ABO types. And the thing to understand about the other kingdoms or the other species is that blood types don't work the same way as they do in animals as they do in humans. For instance, if you're a pig and you're blood type O, you get a coat of black fur. But it doesn't have much of an effect on your digestive tract. So looking at cats, I believe have a variety of different types of blood type A. And yet cats are almost all carnivores. I mean, there's no such thing as a non-carnivorous cat. So we can see here that the A diet would be a terrible choice for a cat, although people have tried to make cats vegetarian and vegan, and it just results in a very sick cat. So the answer is that you probably don't need your cat to follow the blood type diet because the significance of blood type in cats and dogs and ponies and pigs is different because the gene that blood type is in humans links to functions in humans, but the genes that regulate blood type in other species don't link to those same functions. It's a very species-specific situation. So, great question. And strangely enough, one of the critics once, a long time ago, wrote, well, animals have different blood types. How come they don't eat for their blood type? But of course, you know, this person was just advertising their own unawareness of this fact that, you know, animals have a numerous numbers of blood types that humans don't possess, and humans have probably 46 different blood types, probably half of which don't show up in other species. Well, there's some serious stuff here, and I have to say I can't get into the treatment of really serious medical issues on a Facebook Live performance. But there's a person here who was talking about having a situation called a liposarcoma tumor, which is a fatty muscle tissue tumor that grows typically in the legs, and in children it's got a very serious outcome, and that is something that I definitely feel is a serious situation that needs to be obviously looked at and obviously treated with a combination of conventional and naturopathic methods. Generally yields the best results. So I would suggest that really the best approach there is to coordinate whatever treatment is being done with other things that may be somewhat helpful. When I have a person who I am not working with directly and they ask me for advice on things to do for cancers and malignancies, I tend to be a little skittish. But there is one thing I can generally uniformly recommend because it's fundamentally harmless. And that is an herb called Scutellaria, or otherwise known as Chinese skullcap. And the reason that I recommend it is Chinese skullcap has unique ingredients that induce a phenomenon called apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. In other words, the cell, when it's injured, sizes itself up and says, I have to make a choice here. Do I invest energy into repairing myself, or do I just take one for the team and kill myself? Okay? And when you have a situation where you're trying to regulate a fast-growing situation like a tumor, you're really trying to get cells to take that last decision. You don't want them repairing themselves. You want them considering taking one for the team. And the nice thing about Chinese Scoot is it's got an extensive repertoire of studies on that it induces this actual cell suicide function, which I think is just a wonderful thing. It doesn't interfere with any of the normal mechanisms by which we regulate cancer, chemotherapy, radiation. Matter of fact, there's some studies that show that it seems to make radiation therapy work better. There's lots of interactions you can worry about when it comes to drugs and nutrients and herbs and things. And I always tend to have to be very, very cognizant of that when I was working with patients. But this one is one that you might want to look into. If you work with a professional, you can think about whether or not that's something that you can look up, work together, research. But I think it's the nicest way to look at how I could help a person with a serious illness and feel like I was being useful, despite the fact that really, you know, I don't know the person well enough to be able to think I'm going to be very helpful beyond that. But I do wish you well. Natural way to eradicate or minimize C. diff. Well, my advice there is you try to find somebody who's got a kid who's never taken an antibiotic, super healthy, and see if you can buy some of their poop and see whether or not that's something you might want to make a slurry and contemplate taking something of that yourself. Because what are called the fecal transplantation is really shown to be effective for exactly one thing, C. diff. Other things that I have used in the past, not as impressive, but obviously anything that can crowd the organism out is going to be something that would be of great benefit. So probiotics, obviously, anything that would foster increasing diversity. So you would look increasing the butyric acid through an intrinsic product would be a great way of doing that. The only other thing you can do as far as that goes is some people have gone the colonic irrigation route. I think in a way that's probably something that at the time was the best treatment that we had besides the fecal transplantation. I think in essence, it's a very difficult thing. It tends to actually over time in most patients resolve, but it's really a function, I think, of a very tired, twisted, out of balance colon community, bacteria-wise, and restoring any sort of a balance, any sort of competing, having all the various parts basically working together is probably the smartest strategy in the long run. It's actually on the rise now because of all the antibiotics that are out there that people are taking and things. And it's Clostridium is a type of bacteria. It's a difficult bacteria. Now, interesting because Clostridium is you know, it's responsible for what's that thing you get when you eat food that's in a can too long? I forget what it used to be called, ptomaine poisoning or food poisoning. That's Clostridium as well. But there's a lot of versions of Clostridium that are actually very good for you. So it's really a question of really, why did this strain be so pronounced when all the others are fine? And the truth is, it's almost always a question of the, you know, I'm a big fan of what's called the indirect approach. In other words, yeah, we know this is the way we're supposed to be blunting it, but how do we deal with the tail end of this? What is it using to continue? What is it using to survive? Can we do something to restrict its access to things it needs to continue to grow? Do we need to just fight it head on, or can we go around the sides and manipulate things that might be of benefit to controlling it in an indirect fashion? How do medicinal mushrooms fit into right for your type plans? Good question. Pretty well, actually. I think you'll find most of the type base and the later books have a lot of mushrooms in them, much more than your typical nutrition book, mainly because I'm fascinated with mushrooms due to their immunogenic properties. Mushrooms are full of what are known as high molecular weight polysaccharides. And high molecular weight polysaccharides are one of the few non-protein things in this world that induces antibody formation. So for instance, when you take lenshi, or which is actually just a form of shiitake mushroom, or when you take maitake, which is turkey tail mushroom, you're getting these high molecular weight polysaccharides, and they are inducing immunological changes. They're causing activation through well-known mechanisms that involve what's called mitosis. They're mitogens, so they act in a sort of a stimulating way towards increasing the number and aggressiveness of certain cells of the immune system. In China, medicinal mushrooms are legally allowed in conventional medicine to be prescribed simultaneously with chemotherapy. It's very common there in the medical system. So I like maitake mushroom, number one, because it has very gentle immunogenic properties. I find it works well in situations where you're trying to help a person who's had a long bout of an illness and it's just worn them down to a nub. Maitake is wonderful for that if it's coming out of a long viral, in a long viral session that they're getting what's called neurasthenia. Everything's down. So I love maitake for that. I love other mushrooms as well. The other thing I like too is cordyceps, which is this weird fungus that grows on bugs and things and is kind of extinct almost, but they're now growing it in farms. And cordyceps has some very interesting properties in terms of liver and kidneys. for instance, I was very enthusiastic about taking it in my own case because there's some evidence that shows that it has some benefit in kidney function that could be lost through the medication that you take as a rejection medicine, anti-rejection medicine. I had to not take it because I did some research and found it interfered with one of the drugs. But cordyceps is a great remedy for a variety of things. The Chinese are very fond of it. My friend Mitch Stargrove, who you may know, is very fond of cordyceps. So there's a lot of very good medicine in mushrooms. And I think the most famous mushroom of all is the domestic mushroom that we know as the white silver dollar mushroom, the thing that people eat with steaks, you know, or put in their salad. It's just the general run-of-the-mill mushroom you get at the supermarket. Agaricus bisporus. Agaricus bisporus has the world's most interesting lectin. Okay, now lectin we talked about, bad, lectin's bad, lectin's bad. But lectins are lectins. It's like saying a Swiss Army knife is bad because you stuck it in your eye. It wasn't the Swiss Army knife's fault. It was you're sticking it in the eye that made it a bad thing. The same thing with lectins. Some lectins are problematic, but other lectins actually do some very good things. We're familiar with Helix palmatia as a beneficial lectin. But the lectin in Agaricus bisporus is unique because it does two things that nobody's ever been figured out how to do elsewhere. If you take it, it actually regenerates something called your islets in your pancreas that are responsible for synthesizing insulin. And when people wind up with diabetes, it turns out that they don't really make insulin because these insulin-secreting tissues, known as the islets, don't work. And it turns out that the lectin in common everyday mushrooms has been known to stimulate release of insulin from islet cells that were thought to be completely extinct and non-working in diabetic patients. The second thing that this thing does, which is even more interesting, is that when you give it to people who have polyps in their colon, or early signs that they may be heading towards some sort of neoplastic thing, and you just encourage them to just consume it in a lot amount of mushrooms, they will go back and their subsequent colonoscopies will show that the polyps are generally resolved. And the reason for that is the lectin, again, interacting with the cells of the digestive tract and literally reprogramming them from the outside to rearrange their genetic material on the inside to start to refashion themselves as normal cells and not abnormal cells. So mushrooms are one of my favorite things in the world, and the most favorite mushroom of them all is perhaps the most ubiquitous of them all. Currently taking Polyvite and PhytoCal. Can Genoma Security be taken with these? Absolutely. They're really on two separate planes. Both the Polyvite and PhytoCal are maintenance issue type things, and they're addressing low-level biological needs that are just a result of you living your life. And then when you get into the Genoma line, you're using things that have specific activity. Now, I'll tell you why I like Genoma Security so much, besides the fact that, of course, I was the one who designed it. The reality is that you have to look at what heart tissue wants. Sometimes the best thing to understand a disease is to look at the tissue and ask yourself, what's this thing asking me for? Now, you're probably familiar, in the military, they have a thing called the motor pool. So that if you're part of a brigade, not everybody gets a Jeep, okay? So they have a thing called the motor pool, which is where they store the Jeeps. And if you want a Jeep, you submit a request and they give you a Jeep, okay? That's how they solve the problem. In your heart muscle, you have a thing called the free amino acid pool. This is the pool of amino acids your heart muscles can draw upon when they need it. Now, in the free amino acid pool, there's an amino acid called taurine. And then there's nothing. Second place isn't even close. So your heart, when it's looking around for something to patch up a problem, it looks around for taurine. And if you look at what makes a heart enlarge, if you look at what makes a heart lack function as a pump, it'll be three things. It'll be taurine, it'll be zinc, and it will be coenzyme Q10. If you put those three things together and throw in a little herb here and a little herb there, you have Genoma Security. And the idea is, again, asking the question, what is the system in need of and trying to give it to it. Now, the interesting thing that I discovered when I went through my own issues with the lung transplant is that the prior condition, which was genetic, I inherited it from my father, the process of having the lung condition placed a lot of strain on the heart. And I had a moderately enlarged heart at the time that I was going through evaluation for transplant. I, of course, wanted to do something about that. I did two things. I was in pulmonary rehab, and then I decided I wanted to rehab myself at home, and I took the Genoma Cardia. And in both cases, a cardiac echosonogram showed that the enlargement had disappeared. So you can make improvements in cardiac muscle function, and sometimes you don't even have to work that hard, okay? I continue to exercise, I continue to take the Genoma Cardia, and I have increasing. I mean, it's amazing. I'm on this thing called a new step, which is a kind of a pedally army thing, and I can't go any higher. I'm at a 10, and I do 40 minutes. I don't know what I should go to next. I probably should get on a treadmill and just put the elevation at some ridiculous incline. But yes, you can combine Genoma Cardia with those two products. Has ancient grains, particular einkorn, been studied for their effects on those who avoid wheat? Is it really different? Excuse me. Einkorn is definitely an ancient wheat. It falls in the framework of a spelt in that it doesn't have the high level of agglutinins. And it seems that the wheat germ agglutinin that sort of characterizes normal conventional wheat seems to be in less concentration there. So I tend to tell patients, if you can tolerate spelt, you're probably going to be able to tolerate einkorn. But you have to kind of try that on yourself because people are all a little bit different in terms of how they respond to it. But it's an interesting grain because it has a very nutty flavor. I've used it in my baking, and sometimes it's worked out rather well. Somebody asked me on the prior get-together, which we never got to, what do I think of the mRNA vaccines? And I thought, that's a question that deserves an answer because there's a lot of confusion, and frankly, we were lied to by the powers that be, governmental and professional. So let's see if we can separate fact from fiction. Let's start with the most basic thing. The original COVID, the beta strain, was a very bad strain of virus. People died. There's no question about it. My favorite composer, Harold Budd, died from COVID, okay? One of my other favorite composers, Mark Mothersbaugh, the guy who did the music from the Rugrats, walks around now with a black patch on his eye because his eye went completely dead from COVID. It was a bad thing. When you watched in China people like in the streets fumigating and bodies and stuff, that was the beta strain. After COVID went to what's called Omicron, it did what most viruses do. Because viruses, even though they don't have brains, they're not dumb. You don't want to kill everybody because that takes you out of the picture if you're a parasite. You want to keep people around so you can parasitize them. And if you kill everybody, that doesn't really help the picture much, doesn't help your cause. So normally the tendency in heavily lethal infections is that after the first pandemic-y, epidemic-y, everybody's dying-y kind of thing, it tends to simmer down. And Omicron was the first example of that. Now, our theories about vaccination with mRNA were predicated on the beta strain, the one that was killing people. And when they got to the point that they had the vaccine, we were already in Omicron and we had some of the milder strains. And I think the authorities kind of missed the bus because in a respect, I think the smarter thing would have been to say, if you are in a high-risk group, this is a good vaccine. If you're over 65. When you're old, you have a condition called anergy, A-N-E-R-G-Y. It means your immune system gets tired, like the rest of you. Everything gets tired, your immune system gets tired. So typically, when you vaccinate an older person because they are anergic, they don't have the reactions like you do when you vaccinate a 5-year-old or a 19-year-old. So we could have easily said, all right, these lower, milder strains that we have now, they're only going to kill the immunocompromised, the elderly, the people with comorbidities. That should have been the target group for vaccination. We didn't need to vaccinate everybody because we were going on the idea that we could produce something called herd immunity. In other words, if we vaccinate everybody, we're going to eliminate this thing altogether. That only works for smallpox because smallpox has a very specific antigen structure that doesn't vary. Okay? We've been trying to make vaccinations against coronaviruses for 50 years, and they're about as successful as our vaccinations against influenza. It changes all the time. So the best you can hope for is to use a vaccine against coronaviruses to not get herd immunity, to not prevent you from getting a coronavirus infection, but to rather prevent you from getting killed by a coronavirus infection. And that should have been the reasonable expectation. Now let's talk about technology. I said before, a Swiss Army knife is a bad thing if you stick yourself in the eye. But it's a good thing if you need it to start a fire, or you need to get the screwdriver part out to get something out of an electrical outlet that you need. In other words, it's not the tool that defines the value, the function. It's the utilization of it. Okay? So looking at it from that perspective, mRNA vaccines are not a bad thing. It's a technology. It was misappropriated and sold down the river in this pandemic. But believe you me, it's an interesting technology that actually mimics a function that our body does all day long. We're constantly making messenger RNA and constantly taking images and pictures of DNA and converting them into reality. So thinking at it from that perspective, I would say that don't go like, woo, boogeyman, messenger RNA. Realize that there was a real bad dumpster fire of an introduction of this technology. But one of these days, they're going to have a messenger RNA that's going to do something profound, like maybe immunize you against a certain type of cancer, or immunize you against a certain type of lethal fungal infection, or maybe still have the effect of producing changes in people who need them the most, immunocompromised cancer patients. So keep an open mind and realize that the case history that was used to demonstrate their value was heavily compromised by a lot of governmental garbage, a lot of pharma garbage, and a lot of major media garbage. The best liver detox for a blood B non-secretor except quitting the wine. There's a lot of good ways you can work on detoxing your liver, and it's unfortunately a very highly misused phrase because everybody detoxes everything, mainly because people use the phrase unwarranted because their understanding of detox extends about as far as their understanding of tox. And if you're going to understand detox, you really need to understand tox. And what's a toxin? A toxin is, well, something that came out of the atmosphere and you breathe, or something came out of the water that you drank, or something that was in a drug you took, or something that you manufactured in some discordant way that got stuck in the wrong pipeline, so you made your own toxin. They're all different ways of being able to look at the same thing, which is that your liver has to go through a process of trying to figure out what to do with this thing. And the liver has a phenomenal capability of doing this. It actually has what's called a two-step process, phase 1, phase 2. Some people would argue there's even a phase 3. But phase 1 is very interesting because that's where all the drug interactions and all those other things occur. And it's because your body has to take the substance when it first gets it and convert it into something it can do something with, okay? Interesting that when it comes in, you don't work on it as is. You have to convert it into something that you can then work on. And this is done in phase 1. Now, the weird part about phase 1 is that oftentimes the thing that the toxin gets converted into so that the body can work on it is more toxic than the thing itself. And that is a problem that is passed on to phase 2. So phase 2, which is the famous glutathione and N-acetylcysteine and glucuronic acid, the whole purpose of phase 2 is to take this toxic intermediary and figure out how to convert it into a salt so that you can get rid of it. And that is the keynote of detox in a rational way. Phase 1 is going to make something, I always tell patients, it's like being in a relay race, and instead of getting past the baton, you get past a stick of dynamite. That's kind of like what happens with phase 1 if it's out of whack. So now phase 2 has to find a way of being able to do that. Phase 2 has one major requirement, and it's literally called the currency of detoxification, and that is a molecule called glutathione. Glutathione is produced through what are called peroxidases in the liver. There's a lot of genetic variation in their production, and some people do a great job, other people, not so good. One of the other things you can look into, though, is the NAC, N-acetylcysteine, like in the Redoxon product, because N-acetylcysteine goes into the production of glutathione. So if you're feeling like maybe phase 2 is something you're struggling with, NAC or glutathione. NAC is actually better than glutathione because glutathione oftentimes doesn't survive the digestive process to get to the liver as glutathione, whereas NAC will get to the liver and the liver will make it into glutathione. So now we're at phase 2, we're going to make a salt. At that point you have to do what's called either glucuronidation. All of these functions are all nutritionally accessible. They're influenced by certain things. So looking at that from the standpoint of herbalism, the two best ones I think, well 3 maybe, I would say silymarin, eclipta, and phyllanthus are the 3 top liver plants that have a role in coordinating either the successful conversion of phase 1 to phase 2 or the successful completion of phase 2. You can look into any of those. The phylantha and eclipta have a long history in Ayurvedic medicine, and silymarin has a long history in Western medicine, to the point that I think I may have mentioned this on the last talk. When I was a student at Bastyr University, the University of Washington School of Medicine called us up and said, you guys got any of that mill thistle? And we said, why? They go, well, we got 2 mountaineers who have Amanita mushroom poisoning, and we want to give them some milk thistle. So we sent the milk thistle along there. But actually the reality is it's a very powerful protectant of the liver. So looking at it from that perspective, you have these particularly wonderful plants. I mean, there's a lot of representational aspects in the herbal kingdom when it comes to the liver. But my 3 favorites are phyllanthus, eclipta, and silymarin. Those are going to be the ones that are going to be the best. For bees, I'd probably make a strong case for silymarin for sure. Other things that work well, it's hard to say. Substance-wise, vitamin-wise, not too much. Make sure your vitamin C levels are adequate. Beyond that, it's hard to say. The other things too, obviously, is the major thing that helps detoxification in the liver, believe it or not, is fiber. So make sure you're a high fiber diet, and alcohol, not a great thing, but I don't fall on the side of never drink alcohol. I don't like people who think like that. I don't like people who can't hold 2 separate ideas in their head at the same time, and it's sort of like a problem in our world where everything's like universally good or universally bad. I went through the whole, well, soy's bad, soy's bad, soy's bad, red meat's bad, red meat's bad, red meat's bad. And it's like, you got to be able to hold 2 thoughts in your head at the same time. It's probably bad for some people, probably okay for others. And it's probably soy, same thing with soy. Soy is great for some people and it's not so good for others. But we love to have absolutist type thoughts. We want to be absolutely certain about something. And that takes me to the question of seed oils, one of the questions asked here. Well, everybody's got a problem with seed oils now. But the interesting thing about it is that it's one of those things that has a hypothetical argument in favor of it, and it has absolutely no research behind it. So in other words, if you look at the studies that look at the types of things that go into seed, and I'm not talking about the argument like, they're making the seed oils like they make paint, and, they don't really, I'm talking about somebody who made a good product, okay? Let's on the assumption that the seed that your oil came from was made by somebody who had your best interest in mind and wasn't trying to sell you something that they were gonna use to take they were gonna use to take the paint off your car, okay? We're not talking about that, okay? We're talking about other things like flaxseed oil, linseed oil. We're talking about the oils that block icosanoid formation, primrose oil. A lot of these oils, they are, well documented to have tremendous health benefit. Now, do you want to go around and use an inordinate amount of seed oils? I don't think it's a great idea. It should be varied. I love olive oil. I'll put olive oil in anything, okay? But the reality is, I think when you make a case against seed oils, the strongest argument is that they're heavily hydrogenated when they go into processed foods. And that is really the place you want to steer clear of them. But if you've got a very high quality flaxseed oil, you've got a very high quality oil that basically is something that's a nice high polysaccharide content oil and well made with quality and not rancidified, you got nothing to worry about. And the literature supports that. There's far more evidence that these things are of benefit than they are detrimental. Now, should you be eating tallow in place of seed oil? I don't know. As a type A, that sounds like a surefire formula for coronary artery disease. But then again, what do I know? I'm not RFK Jr. Please let us know the best eye vitamins for ocular pressure. I don't know if there is a good eye vitamin for ocular pressure. I think there is some stuff that has been studied that may have benefit, but ocular pressure is something that really has to be monitored by people who know what they're doing. And I'm assuming that you're getting your tonographic readings and all that kind of stuff that you're supposed to do, because ocular pressure could cause retinal damage if it goes too far along there. So you want to make sure you're on top of that. Having said that, the literature on ocular pressure is not too bad in terms of quercetin, vitamin C, and an herb called Coleus forskolin, which contains an ingredient called forskolin. It turns out that the quercetin is involved in having an effect on an enzyme. Let's see if I can remember this thing. It's a reductase enzyme that has something to do with the pressure type component in the eye. Forskolin is known to have a lowering effect on eye pressure. That's well reported in the literature, and vitamin C as well. So I would start with those three things. But, again, you got to pay careful attention to this stuff because, eye pressure is not something you mess around with. Blood type A non-secretor, my vitamin D level was 22 on my recent blood test. Painfully aware, lack of self-care. Do not want to take the 50,000 D2 script from my doctor. Is it safe to take 3 to 4 of your Phyto D a day instead, and very mindful of getting sun exposure, then retest in 3 months? In the past, my vitamin D levels have been 50 plus. That's a great point on 2 levels. Number one, it's a good idea to keep your vitamin D levels above 50. If you keep your vitamin D levels above 50, wonderful things happen to you. Because, you see, vitamin D, people think bones, they think sunshine, but vitamin D is a nuclear factor. In other words, the vitamin D receptor is part of how your nucleus communicates in terms of telling the cell what it wants done. So there are literally hundreds of genes that have to depend on a somewhat tenuous relationship with vitamin D. If you keep your vitamin D levels above 50, your chances of being able to achieve some reasonable health span go up very, very significantly. So we've got to get your vitamin D levels above 50. The prescription medicine is effective, okay? If you take the vitamin D2 that they give you, usually it's once a week, they give you a 50,000 IU pill, and your numbers will come up. The question, of course, is whether or not you've done anything to support that or you're going to rely on that for the rest of your life. What I like about the Phyto D is that it seems to be much more synergistic, that it has not only the effect of supplying vitamin D, but it has, because of the cofactors and the synergists in the formula, the ability to induce the body to become a little bit more efficient at being able to do the right thing with the vitamin D. It gets through the normal mechanisms. So I would say for sure, try the Phyto D, test, make sure that your numbers are good. If it turns out that you can't get a boost, you can try the pharmaceutical version. It's not going to be the end of the world, but it doesn't really have any long-term promise because once as soon as you stop that, it's going to go back down. So you're doing all the right things. Try to get sun exposure, and also to think about the Phyto D complex, a great formula. We sell more of that than almost anything else. I think the only thing the company sells more than Phyto D is the methylcobalamin, if I remember correctly. The blood type stuff is different. We sell a lot of the blood type stuff, but the Genoma line, it's those two things. I think they're the two. If you know you are eating foods off your list, how do you manage this? There are so many supplement recommendations. How do you know which ones to take? You know, you really have to be your own best friend, okay? And I think these are perfect opportunities for you to have a chat with a Chat GPT or a Claude, and with the correct prompts, see what kind of advice it's giving you based upon what you're telling it, okay? Nobody wants to take too many things. Number one, you know, my father used to say, too much good is no good, okay? So you don't want to take a shoe box full of vitamins just to make sure you're covered every need. First of all, the problem with that is a thing that we understand in systems biology, which is that you make a system more fragile by over-anticipating its needs. So the more you give something to somebody or something based upon the fact that you think it might be good for them, is the more you're going to increase their own fragility, right? If I come over to your house and do your math homework, and you still have to take the SAT, did I do you a favor or not? Okay? Same thing here. Looking at it from the vitamin D perspective or looking at it from a vitamin perspective, you want to have a carrot and stick approach to your approach to nutrition, I believe. You always want to be in the world of three-dimensional chess, 2 moves ahead. Okay? What do I need and how do I get there and how do I stay there? They're all different arguments. And each one has a different time, a different place, and in a different time and place, a different solution. So you have to be careful about overdoing it just as much as you have to be careful about under-realizing what needs to be done, okay? So I like to look at what I take as a reflection of my current assessment of where I am. So I'm always changing things based upon what my goals are. Right now, my goals are, you know, I don't want to reject this lung, you know? I want to not get to be an old man with no muscle. I would like to continue to write computer code. I need my cognitive functions. So by making a short list of the things that I believe are important enough for me to devote myself to attaining them, I have my answer right there. And then the question becomes, how do I do it? And AI can be a very helpful thing. Just as good as an expert sometimes, maybe sometimes even better, as long as you ask the right questions. So I would suggest that looking at that, you know, the fact that food is something people sometimes get very rigid about, okay? I used to have patients who would like beat on themselves if they didn't follow the diet perfectly for one day. And I used to tell them a story because, you know, I went to school in Seattle. And the old Seattle in the 1970s, if you went to a red light, everybody stayed on the sidewalk on the corner. Nobody stood in the street, and everybody waited until the light turned green. And strangely enough, they would sit on the corner at a red light and wait until it turned green, even if there was no traffic. Well, of course, coming from New York, the first thing I would do is start crossing the street, right? So I tell patients, it's like, it's a good rule to wait at the corner until the light turns green. But it's a bad rule to wait at the corner for the light to turn green at 4 o'clock in the morning if there's nobody there, okay? Then all of a sudden it's becoming a rule that's more restrictive unnecessarily. So look at it as an expansive thing. How can you amortize what you're doing? You're playing the long game when you eat a certain way, when you behave a certain way, okay? And that's going to end it for us today. So thank you very much, and we will see you again. I am going to be, believe it or not, at the end of this month, Martha and I, the girlfriend, are going to be on the Queen Mary for a week going across the Atlantic to celebrate my year of recovery. So I will see you when I come back, hopefully with stories to tell about what it's like to be on a Cunard liner and going over to the old country for a while. In the meantime, thank you. Great questions. I'll see you all perhaps maybe in another month or so. So take care.